Cape Cod Broadcasting weaves the listening environments of 99.9 WQRC, Ocean 104.7, WFCC Classical 107.5, Cape Country 104, and CapeCon.com's website experience to reflect the lifestyles of the people who live, work, and play on Cape Cod. We hope that you enjoy this podcast.
I'm Laura Reckford, and this is Sunday Journal. I'm here in the studio with Brenda Conlan, a prevention specialist from Eastham, and we're talking about the challenges of parenting in this day and age, particularly with regard to keeping children and teenagers away from drugs and alcohol. Brenda, welcome to the show.
I'm so pleased to be here. Thanks, Laura.
Let's start off by talking about your background and how you got into this line of work, talking to students and parents about parenting.
Well, I got into it in kind of a funny way, like many people get into their careers. So I started out as a language teacher, and I lived in Europe for 5 years right after college. And when I came back to America, I wanted to keep teaching, but there wasn't a lot of opportunity to teach German or even English. So I got into doing prevention work with a larger company. This was in 1994. And then in 1999, I left that company and sort of started my own empire. And I've been going around to schools all over the world ever since.
And in a talk you gave recently at the Hyannis Youth and Community Center, one of your main messages to parents was that their children think of them first when they are thinking about maybe trying drugs or alcohol, and I thought that really resonated. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, it's really true. Children really do keep their parents' norms for the most part. It's not perfect because we're talking about human behavior. But what I find when I'm talking to teenagers is that they really do care about their parents' regard for them, and they don't want to do things that upset their parents if there's a good relationship in place, and that's an important caveat.
And that message may surprise a lot of parents.
Well, parents figure out that their kids don't actually listen actively. They don't attend to their parents when their parents are talking, but kids really hear. And that's what I want parents to really believe. And I encourage parents to be that quiet roar in the back of their child's mind when their child is out in the world with opportunities to do unhealthy things.
And you talked about different parenting styles that you run into, and I was interested that the way you put it is you've learned about these in some ways by the way kids tell you about how their parents parent them.
Absolutely. And I often ask kids if they know anyone whose parents are what I call ostrich parents, parents who aren't paying attention, who have their heads buried, who think that their children would never do anything unhealthy or probably trust their kids too much. And if I say to kids, do you have any friends whose parents are like that? They say, oh, yeah. And they're all over the place. They're just doing anything. So I think it's important that actually one of the things that I talk about with parents is the difference between faith and trust. I think it's important to have a lot of faith in your child, their basic wealth as a person. But I wouldn't say that trust is a big element of raising teenagers.
You talk about the ostrich parent, and then you had a few different types of parents that you talked about in this recent talk. And tell me about some of those. I remember the groovy parent, for instance.
Yeah, the groovy parent is somebody who's trying to be hip and young and probably wants to be friends with their child. And if you're friends with your kids, you can't really be an authority figure. And those parents tend to be permissive and lenient, and their kids tend to be pretty anxious because they don't have a lot of boundaries in their lives. And they're sort of pushing the envelope, but the envelope, they never find it because their parents aren't firm enough, and they're the ones who really get in the most trouble. The opposite of the groovy parent would be the over-my-dead-body parent, and that's the parent who's really threatening, does a lot of lecturing, and again, there isn't much of a relationship with any of these parenting styles because the child with the groovy parent is almost taking care of the parent. With the ostrich parent, the child doesn't have enough contact with the parent, doesn't know how the parent feels. And with the over-my-dead-body parent, the child has nothing to preserve because it doesn't feel like a nutritious or a valuable relationship. So what I encourage parents to do is be the consultant parent, which is a parent who does a lot of listening, who is calm and approachable and informed, and actually has a relationship with the child that's mutual and loving and caring.
One thing you were talking about, particularly with regard to, I think it was the groovy parent, is that they think that they're actually preventing bad things by allowing kids to perhaps have a party at their house. And you were pointing out why actually that's not a good idea.
Well, one of the things that we know for sure about addiction is that it begins early. And the most important thing that parents can understand is that the longer their children postpone their relationship with alcohol, the better. And this is for development, this is for acquiring social skills and problem-solving skills. And only adults have adult brains. A kid brain is not an adult brain with fewer miles on it. It's something very, very different. And it's really a thing of beauty. It's a time when kids are very creative and flexible, and their brains are still developing. They're incredibly impressionable. So the most important thing a parent can do for his or her child is really protect the brain of the child. And using alcohol and other drugs during adolescence is incredibly hazardous, both physically, spiritually, developmentally, and it's the exact wrong thing to do, to let your child use any substances at all.
I'm Laura Reckford, and this is Sunday Journal. I'm talking to Brenda Conlan, a prevention specialist from Eastham, about how to keep kids away from drugs and alcohol. Now, one of the things I thought was interesting that you talked about, that the teenage years now seem to extend about 20 years, I think you said. Can you explain that?
Well, puberty is beginning earlier, an average of 2 years earlier, in both boys and girls. So it's starting at around 11, where it was 13 when you and I were growing up. And adulthood begins much, much later. Seriously, there are many, many, many people in their late 20s still completely dependent on parents, either living at home after college or still needing a lot of support. So what used to take 6 years, maybe from 13 to 19, now takes almost 20 years because it goes from 11 to 31 when your kid is sitting around Starbucks thinking about graduate school. So it really is a much longer ride than it used to be.
Now, the stretching to age 30, what's behind that?
Well, it's cultural. I think it's economic to a certain point. I just think we happen to be in a time when it's very difficult to get a professional job, even if you have a college degree. I think kids are taking longer to go through school. And I also think that young adults do need support. So maybe part of it is a good thing. You know, a 20-year-old is not really fully an adult. They say that the brain develops completely at age 25. So it's not all bad, but because it's going to be a long, drawn-out relationship, if you fall down at the beginning, like the groovy parent, then you're going to have a very tough time.
How you talk to your 15-year-old is not how you talk to your 25-year-old, even if they're living in that same room in your house.
Well, I think that if you couch this in health and safety terms, and you always introduce the topic of alcohol and other drug use as something that you're worried about on a safety level or a health level, then it's not going to feel like a lecture and it's not going to feel like rules. It's going to feel like love. You know, I care about you so much. You're my hope diamond. If anything ever happened to you, I'd never be okay again. So I need to really parent you around this issue. And I think that it's also all about decision making, which is a much larger umbrella. And even with very young children, helping them understand what decision-making really is, that it involves some thought and some consideration, and that it always affects relationships, and that relationships really matter in life, and that even if you're talking to a fifth grader about being kind to friends or not gossiping or not looking at a friend's homework if you didn't do yours, much lower level sort of decision making, it's important to kind of walk your child through that. Obviously, if you have a 20 or a 25-year-old, you're having much different conversations. And if you've done things right, you're going to have a 20 or a 25-year-old who's not addicted to drugs, who's reasonable, who actually has a set of skills that they are using. That's the goal.
There's also this aspect of not everyone is doing drugs and alcohol.
Very much so, and I'm so glad that you brought that up. There's this huge group of people who are not using alcohol or other drugs. They're doing great. They're having fantastic lives. They're just regular people, and we just don't know about them. They're invisible. Nothing's written about them. No movies are made about them. There's just no voice there. And I think that if we could galvanize that group of people, that could be really powerful. So, yes, the everybody's doing it idea really is a problem, and it's a problem for kids because if you have an 8th grader who thinks that 90% of high schoolers are drinking and using other drugs, that sets that 8th grader up to prepare to do that, in a sense. In fact, I met one girl recently, an 8th grade girl in New York City, who was about to go to high school, and I said, so just give me a number. How many of the high school students if the high school you're going to, do you think are actually drinking? And she said, 95%. And I said, wow, do you understand, math? And she goes, yeah, I get good grades in math. And I said, okay, let's talk about the 5% who you think aren't drinking. And she said, well, I think they prefer to smoke weed. And I was like, oh. But her numbers are totally wrong, but she might still live to them.
When they've done these studies about this is when they've shown that actually there really are a good percentage of kids that are not doing drugs and alcohol.
Always. And that's very reliable data. You can go to Monitoring the Future, which is an excellent survey company, and look at their data, which they've been doing for over 40 years. And it's very consistent. And there is always a huge number of kids who are not using.
When you talk to kids, what are some of the other surprising things they say on this topic?
Well, one of the things that's interesting is that they're actually really eager to talk about it. Once they realize that it's safe and I'm not armed and I'm just going to have an honest conversation with them, they love it. They have questions. They're very open. And if I ask kids, well, when's the last time you talked about alcohol and other drugs? They always refer back to, oh, this guy came and gave an assembly last year. And I say, no. When's the last time the topic came up in conversation? And they say, oh, at lunchtime or yesterday. So it is a constant conversation in their world. It's on social media, Facebook, Instagram. So much of the music that they listen to is about alcohol, drugs, sex, getting all three simultaneously, getting rich while you do it. So they're bombarded with the topic, but very often it's not accurate and it's not from someone who cares about them. So I try and have this conversation and give some real facts and some real information, and it usually works out really well, and they're happy to talk with me.
Have you ever talked to kids who are in recovery?
Mm-hmm.
And do they talk to you about why they started?
Yes. I never ask anybody, obviously, to reveal something in a classroom setting, but I have many, many people approach me just privately with either stories like that or stories about parents or questions. And I'm a person in recovery. And I probably should have mentioned that at the beginning. It was so long ago that I used alcohol and other drugs abusively from age 12 to 17, and I'm now 50, so it's been 33 years since all that happened. But I'm honest with kids about that. And I also tell them I grew up in an alcoholic home and what it felt like to have relatives who were alcoholic and how damaging that was to relationships. And that's very compelling for kids as well.
One message I think you were giving to parents the other day was that it's not because you're a bad parent that your kid might start down this road, but there are ways that you can perhaps steer them back if they do start on this road.
Absolutely. I'm a very optimistic person, especially about this issue, because it's one of the few illnesses where you actually can recover, and there is treatment available, and there's a lot of support out there. So that's the good news. The bad news about alcohol and other drug addiction is that it's a chronic, debilitating, lifelong illness. And whether you think of it as a disease or an illness, I feel very strongly that it's a form of suffering. And it's something that all parents would want their children to avoid.
After your talk, I heard some parents talking about how early they should talk to their kids on this subject.
Again, I think that depends a little bit on the child and the situation the child is living in. I think that decision-making is a constant conversation between parent and child, and that's really, even about health and nutrition and brushing teeth and what have you. And as the kid ages, obviously, you're going to start to talk about some of these other topics because the child is hearing about it, whether you're talking about it or not. As a parent, the child is hearing about it just out in the world. So you can have Miley Cyrus and Jay-Z and Beyonce educate your child, or you can do it. Those are your choices.
And I think what we were talking about before is this message that's not necessarily bad parenting that gets a kid into that, but that they can also recover.
Absolutely, yeah. And, it's never a parent's fault exactly when a child gets into alcohol or other drugs. There are many, many, many factors that go into that. But how a parent responds once it happens is crucial. The first response is the most important one. So if your 10th grader comes home drunk, you need to respond and really help that child understand what this means to the family in terms of health, safety, trust, rules, everything.
Now, in the last minute or so that we have left, any final messages you'd like to leave with parents who might be listening today?
I think, again, the most important thing with alcohol is to postpone that relationship. And even things like giving sips at New Year's Eve or 4th of July parties, really put some thought into that because it has no benefit and quite a few risks, because your child could misinterpret that as, my parents are okay with me drinking. And, this is maybe kind of too radical of an analogy, but we all know our children are going to grow up and get involved in sexual activity, but we don't really have them practice it at home as teenagers, certainly. So you might want to take the same stance about alcohol that you would about sex. And with drugs, hopefully never other drugs, because that's just probably never going to work out too well.
And also just keeping those lines of communication open with your kids.
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, we've run out of time. I've been talking to Brenda Conlan, a prevention specialist from Eastham, about different parenting tips to try to keep children and teenagers away from drugs and alcohol. Thank you so much, Brenda, for being with me here today.
That was a quick 17 minutes. Thank you, Laura.
I'm Laura Reckford, and this is Sunday Journal.
This podcast is a presentation of Cape Cod Broadcasting, which is solely responsible for its content. Thank you for listening. For more information, please visit us at capecodbroadcasting.com.